Um, Imagine for a second that your boss forces you to buy a ticket for a weekend team-building riverboat cruise.
Oh, that already sounds terrible.
Right. And they mandate that you wear these like pristine white shoes and a white hat purely so you will look clean in uniform in their promotional photos.
Yeah, like you don't even have a choice in the matter.
Exactly. Your job completely depends on it. Now imagine the boat they rented is totally structurally unsound.
Oh, no.
Yeah. It just rolls over while it's literally still tied to the dock. And 800 of your coworkers drown in this dirty river water, many of them still wearing those mandated white shoes.
It sounds like a dystopian fiction novel, honestly, but that is the exact horrifying reality of the 1915 Eastland disaster in Chicago.
It really is.
I mean, we're looking at a mass casualty event that just decimated a working-class community in a matter of minutes.
Right. Completely wiped them out.
But beyond the mechanics of the actual shipwreck, we are examining the psychological fallout today. We're looking at how a disaster like that fractures the human psyche. And specifically, how artists process unspeakable grief when that grief transforms into just unfiltered burning rage.
And not just any artist. Right. Because today on this deep dive, we are exploring how this specific tragedy completely shattered the popular image of an American literary icon.
Carl Sandburg.
Yes, Carl Sandburg. We're drawing from an audio excerpt of the Flower in the River podcast, specifically episode 171, to uncover a piece of Sandburg's writing that is so raw.
It really is.
And so incredibly radical that it was actually hidden away in an archive for nearly 80 years.
It completely upends the conventional narrative, because Carl Sandburg is deeply embedded in the American literary canon.
Oh, absolutely.
Most people know the polished monument, like the revered white-haired grandfather figure.
Right, the definitive biographer who won a Pulitzer Prize for his work on Abraham Lincoln.
Exactly. We tend to remember that pristine legacy, not the dirt and the sweat it actually took to build it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can understand why the sinking of the Eastland broke Sandburg, we first have to understand who he really was.
Yeah, far removed from the textbooks.
Because looking at his legacy today feels a bit like scrolling through someone's heavily curated LinkedIn profile.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Like they only list multiple Pulitzer Prize winner and esteemed poet, but they conveniently crop out the part where they were a teenage hobo washing dishes in a train yard just to survive.
Yeah, the contrast between the myth and the man is just staggering. I mean, Sandburg was born in 1878 to very poor Swedish immigrants.
Wait, didn't his father change their name?
He did, actually. He changed the family name from Johnson to Sandburg for a purely pragmatic reason.
What was that?
Well, there were simply too many August Johnsons working on the railroad payroll, and it was causing administrative confusion.
Wow, that is wild. So they were really just another cog in the machine.
Exactly. This was a family surviving entirely on the margins of the American industrial machine. Carl left school at the age of 13 just to help support them.
He was only 13.
Yeah, he wasn't sitting in an ivy-covered parlor reading classic literature. I mean, he was laying bricks, he was washing dishes.
That is incredibly tough.
By the time he was 17, he was riding the rails west to Kansas as a hobo, performing brutal manual labor literally just to eat.
And didn't he serve in the military too?
He did. He served in Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War.
And his rise from that level of grit to becoming a pillar of the Chicago literary renaissance is just fascinating.
It really is.
Because he eventually goes to Lombard College, but only because a fellow student he met in the military convinced him to enroll.
Right, and he worked his way through school and didn't even graduate.
Which is crazy for a literary icon. I mean, a professor actually had to pay out of his own pocket to publish Sandburg's first pamphlet of poetry.
Yeah, he eventually finds work as an advertising writer and a newspaper reporter. And he becomes deeply embedded in the labor movements of the era.
Right. He was heavily involved in socialist politics.
Yes, working for the Social Democrat Party in Wisconsin. He even served as secretary to the first socialist mayor of Milwaukee from 1910 to 1912.
And regardless of where you or I fall on the political spectrum today, looking objectively at those affiliations is just crucial.
Absolutely. It is a historical fact.
Yeah, because they completely wired his worldview. You simply cannot understand the man without understanding that background. He never lost that foundational perspective.
Even after he achieved massive literary success.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is how Sandburg's working-class roots dictated his entire approach to art.
How so?
Well, he distinguished himself in 5 different fields over his life: poetry, history, biography, music, and folklore.
That is quite the resume.
Right, and he succeeded in those areas precisely because he wasn't an ivory tower intellectual, looking down at the masses to observe them like subjects in a terrarium.
Yeah, he was one of them.
Exactly. When he wrote about the rhythm of a bricklayer, he was writing from muscle memory. When he criticized the industrial machine, he was criticizing a machine that had literally calloused his own hands.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the summer of 1915. You have this young, brash writer completely wired into the struggles of the working class.
Right. Living and working in Chicago.
And then, in July, this senseless, preventable tragedy strikes the very people he considers his own.
The steamship Eastland sinks right in the Chicago River.
To understand the sheer scale of the horror, we really have to look at the mechanics of the event.
Yeah, the Eastland was loaded with about 2,500 workers and their families.
Which is a massive amount of people.
It is. This was billed as the Western Electric Company picnic. The employees were supposedly being treated to an excursion across the lake to Michigan City.
Treated. I mean, the grim reality of this so-called treat is just stomach-churning.
It really is.
Because these workers were essentially forced to buy tickets for this excursion out of their own meager wages.
Yeah.
And the detail about the clothing is what makes it so incredibly dark, like we mentioned at the start. They were mandated to wear white shoes and white hats.
Right, because the company wanted to use the excursion as a marketing opportunity.
Exactly. They needed the workers to look clean, uniform, and prosperous for the advertising photographs.
It is the ultimate manifestation of mandatory toxic corporate fun.
Yes, totally.
What scaled up to a massive deadly level. They were packed onto this top-heavy, structurally cranky ship that had a known history of instability.
A total recipe for disaster.
Totally. When the passengers gathered on one side of the boat, it simply rolled over at the dock. Over 800 people drowned in a river that was essentially an open sewer at the time.
Oh, that is horrific.
Entire families were wiped out. And the visual of those mandated white hats and shoes floating in the filthy water became this inescapable symbol of corporate negligence.
It is absolutely sickening. I mean, you were packed onto a floating death trap just so your bosses look benevolent on a brochure.
Exactly.
It is no wonder Sandburg exploded. His public response was a furious prose piece published in the International Socialist Review in September of 1915.
Right.
He publicly blamed Secretary of Commerce William C. Redfield, demanding to know why high-salaried bureaucrats allowed an ancient hoodoo tub like the Eastland to sail in the first place.
And Sandburg didn't wait for an official inquiry to assign blame either. In that prose piece, he answers his own question with terrifying clarity.
What did he say?
He writes that the boat sailed because business required it. He actually coined the phrase grim industrial feudalism to describe the entire horrific affair.
Let's drill into that phrase for a second. Grim industrial feudalism.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Sandburg is diagnosing a systemic disease here.
Okay, how so?
Well, in medieval feudalism, the serf's entire existence belonged to the lord of the manor. Sandburg is arguing that in 1915 Chicago, the corporations had become the new lords.
Oh, I see.
They didn't just own the workers' labor during factory hours, they had commodified their leisure time as well.
By forcing them onto that boat for a PR stunt.
Exactly. The company was asserting total ownership over their lives. Sandburg saw those 800 deaths not as a maritime accident, but as the inevitable human cost of a system.
A system that placed absolutely zero value on human life beyond its usefulness to the bottom line.
Precisely.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Because that fiery prose piece we just talked about, that was merely his published reaction.
Yeah.
Sandburg's rage was actually so visceral and so intense that it couldn't be contained within the boundaries of a political essay.
It spilled over into a poem.
A poem that was deemed so radioactive and so unfiltered that it wasn't published until 1993. That is nearly 80 years after he wrote it.
Yeah, scholars eventually discovered the manuscript in his archival files at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.
That is amazing.
It was finally released in a compilation book called Carl Sandburg, Billy Sunday, and Other Poems.
Right.
And the moment you read this poem, which is simply titled The Eastland, the image of the grandfatherly establishment poet entirely evaporates.
It really does. This is the raw, rising poet of the streets.
The vernacular he uses in the poem is jarring. He starts by essentially stating, "My guts ain't ticklish about the Eastland."
My guts ain't ticklish.
Yeah, that specific phrase is a brilliant piece of rough-hewn working-class slang. It means he isn't getting overly emotional, squeamish, or sentimental about the disaster.
I really have to push back on Sandburg here, though.
Okay.
Because on the surface, that sounds incredibly callous. I mean, you have 800 people dead.
Hmm.
Women and children with wet hair and scared faces being hauled off to a makeshift armory morgue for their relatives to claim their stiff bodies.
It is a gruesome scene, for sure.
And Sandberg says his guts aren't ticklish about it. It almost reads like one of those furious draft but never send emails that an employee writes to their boss in a moment of pure blind rage.
Right, the ones you can't actually hit send on because it crosses every conceivable line of professional decency.
Exactly. Is he actually saying, like, who cares about the Eastland victims?
This raises an important question, and the tension you are feeling is exactly what Sandburg intended to provoke.
Oh, really?
Yes. He isn't dismissing the suffering of the Eastland victims at all. He is attacking the profound hypocrisy of the media, the government, and polite society and how they choose which tragedies are worthy of mourning.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense.
He acknowledges the hellish job of fishing 2,500 people in their clean picnic clothes out of a dirty river, but then he forces the reader's gaze elsewhere.
Where does he look?
He says he has an imagination, and he sees a pile of 3,000 dead people killed by the con.
The con, meaning consumption. Tuberculosis.
Exactly that. He points out the quiet, invisible slaughter happening across the country. 3,000 people a year in Chicago and 150,000 a year across the United States were dying from tuberculosis.
Wow, those numbers are staggering.
And Sandburg is hyper-specific about the mechanics of this disease. He writes that they die from too much work and a lack of fresh air and green groceries.
Because tuberculosis thrives in cramped, poorly ventilated tenement housing.
Exactly. It is fundamentally a disease of poverty and exhaustion. And Sandburg explicitly notes that it is the cheap roughnecks, the working women, and their children who suffocate in their own lungs from this.
Right, you hardly ever saw a wealthy banker or a corporation lawyer dying from the con.
Never.
So he is taking this massive, spectacular maritime disaster that has completely consumed the front pages of the newspapers, and he's using it as a mirror.
Yes, exactly.
He is trying to force society to look at the slow-moving daily disasters they actively ignore every single day.
He directs immense anger at the newsboys, the publishers and media moguls who clean up and make a massive profit selling papers with spectacular pictures of a capsized boat.
Yeah.
He argues that if you took all the babies who die in major cities in a single year simply because they didn't have access to good milk and stacked their bodies in a high pile.
That would make a front-page picture.
Yes, that would make a picture for the Sunday papers. But because they die quietly, one by one, in impoverished homes hidden away in the slums, society easily turns a blind eye.
The media demands a spectacle to care about the working class.
That is exactly his point.
He highlights all these ignored daily tragedies with such brutal, relentless imagery in the poem.
Yeah.
It is a very dark portrait of industrial Chicago.
Very dark.
He writes about kids with white faces and skinny legs, rubbing the sleep out of their eyes just to go to the factories and hold on to their jobs.
Yeah.
He writes about women isolated in faded hotels, structural iron workers and factory hands with stubs of arms and stumps of legs.
He paints a picture of bodies physically broken by the machinery while the bosses are just standing over them, yelling for more speed, more output.
It culminates in a devastating final thought. He concludes the poem with the line, I see a dozen Eastlands every morning on my way to work, and a dozen more going home at night.
A dozen Eastlands every morning.
That completely recontextualizes his anger from the beginning of the poem.
Right. He isn't numb to the horror of the boat sinking.
No, he is numb to the fact that the meat grinder of industrialism is killing people all around him constantly. It's happening in the brickyards, the tenements, the slaughterhouses.
But no one seems to care until it happens all at once photogenically on a river.
Exactly. So what does this all mean for Sandburg as he moves forward in his career?
Well, for Sandburg, the sinking of the Eastland wasn't an anomaly. It was simply the loudest, most visible symptom of a systemic disease that was silently killing the working class every hour of every day.
Because this raw, unfiltered view of mortality wasn't just a brief reaction to a single shipwreck. The Eastland disaster seemed to crystallize a lifelong obsession with death for him.
It really did.
And while his tone may have softened and matured over his decades of writing, it never really lost that unyielding edge.
You can actually trace a direct philosophical line from the furious energy of the Eastland to his later, very famous poem, Cool Tombs.
Oh, you know that one?
Yeah. The Flower in the River podcast actually features a remarkable audio clip of Sandburg reading Cool Tombs in his own voice later in his life.
That is so cool to hear the actual author reading it.
It really adds a layer of depth. In that later work, the graphic burning rage has cooled into a more philosophical perspective, but the core message remains just as uncompromising.
It is the concept of death as the great unavoidable equalizer.
Exactly. In Cool Tombs, the frenetic energy of the factories and the screaming of the bosses is replaced by the quiet, inevitable dust.
He writes about Abraham Lincoln being shoveled into the tombs.
Yeah.
Okay? Finally forgetting his assassins.
Yes. He writes about Ulysses S. Grant losing all thought of conmen and Wall Street machinations.
And he notes that even Pocahontas rests in the exact same dust as the lovers, the losers, and the everyday people just walking down the street buying groceries.
He refuses to sentimentalize death, doesn't he?
He really does. Whether he is screaming furiously about corporate negligence in the Eastland or writing calmly about presidents in Cool Tombs, Sandburg is forcing his audience to look squarely at mortality.
Stripping away the comfort of fairy tales, wealth, and status.
Yeah, for Sandburg, death was never simply a private tragedy to be mourned behind closed doors. Death was a powerful lens.
It was a tool.
Right. It was a tool he used to reveal the massive, overarching forces that shaped people's lives. Forces like democracy, grief, war, manual labor, and the unfinished work of America.
When the wealthy corporate executive who mandated the white shoes and the poor factory worker who drowned in them both end up as ashes in the same dust,
It completely exposes the artificiality of the power structures that separated them in life.
it brings us right back to that filter we talked about at the very beginning. Sandburg, especially in his hidden early work, refuses to let us look away from the raw, unedited reality of the human condition.
He forces us to look past the sanitized monuments.
And that is exactly why uncovering the Eastland poem is so vital to understanding American literature.
Yeah.
It serves as a permanent reminder that behind the esteemed, white-haired biographer who dined with presidents, there was a young man whose heart broke for the everyday worker.
And who wielded his pen like a weapon against systemic injustice.
Precisely.
Which brings us entirely back to you listening to this deep dive right now. Hearing Sandburg's century-old rage really makes you stop and consider how we consume the news today.
It really does.
Are we still doing exactly what he was raging against in 1915? I mean, are we easily captivated by the sudden, spectacular disasters that trend on our feeds and dominate the 24-hour news cycle?
While completely turning a blind eye to the slow-moving, daily systemic crises that are happening right in front of us in our own cities.
Exactly. Do we demand a spectacle before we decide to care?
It is a deeply uncomfortable mirror to look into, but an essential one. And it leaves us with one final fascinating thought to mull over.
What is that?
Well, the fact that an American literary icon's most authentic, visceral, and perhaps most culturally important reaction to a tragedy was deemed too raw and sat hidden in a university file cabinet for almost 80 years is staggering.
It is wild to think about.
It makes you wonder about the present day. I mean, what powerful, world-changing art is currently sitting in the digital archives, the cloud storage, or the private hard drives of today's creators?
Oh, wow.
What vital truths are being deemed too radical or too raw for our current algorithms, just waiting for a future generation to finally uncover them?
What an incredible thought. History isn't just what makes it into the neatly bound textbooks. It is what is waiting in the dark to be discovered when we finally decide to look past the filter.
Very true.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the neat narratives, and we'll see you next time.